in the morning, beneath the stars so bright. Pull your hat down, make sure your cinch is tight. Horses kinda snuffy, cold chill up your spine. You'll get your ass moving, son, we're burning daylight.
Howdy there, I'm Matt McKinley and we're burning daylight.
In the saddle till the job's done right.
Welcome to Burnin' Daylight, the only podcast for the working cowboy. Brought to you by Stetson Ranches out of Fromberg, Montana.
Well, howdy there, daylight burners. Happy Monday. Hope you all had a good weekend. And I don't know, it cooled off here quite a little bit. So, anyway, I apologize for not putting an episode out on Friday. I had every intention of doing so. And then, well, fall works caught up with us, and we had new calves coming in. We had calves that were already here falling apart on us. Not too bad, but just enough to where we had to work a little bit. It was a busy week, and gonna do one with Aaron, but he was in Michigan doing gay stuff. That's what he does. Don't let the wife and 2 kids fool you. Does a lot of gay stuff. Anyways, so didn't have one lined up there. Thought, well, we'll do a bull session. And Thursday morning rolled around, and I didn't have anybody lined up. And I thought I'll get right on that at noontime. Go to lunch, and I'll message a few fellas, see if we can get a good old bullshit session going. Well, lunchtime came and went, and we worked right through it. I believe on Thursday. Yeah, I'm pretty sure we did on Thursday. And so didn't happen. And yeah, it was a heck of a long day on Thursday. So I got home and sat down and I fell asleep on the couch. So yeah, nothing came out Friday, and I apologize for that, but, well, you'll have it sometimes. So, anyways, moving on now. I think I got a pretty good episode for you. I think you'll like it. Little different than one I've done before. It's a historical aspect, Tale of Two Railways. And so you've listened to plenty of my history ones if you've been listening for a while, but this one, of course, being I don't even know if libertarian's a good word to use anymore. That seemed like I don't know what labels to call myself, but I'm very much a free market guy and anti-government corruption guy. So I picked out Union Pacific. Everybody knows Union Pacific. It was the Transcontinental Railroad, first time connecting the east and west coasts of the U.S. By railway, done by Union Pacific. And then, of course, I've got, if you saw the front scene of this on YouTube, you saw the Great Northern Railway, and it was more up north, Great Northern, but it connected Minneapolis to Seattle, and came along a little later, and there was a pretty big split between the two. So we'll, as I said, Great Northern Railway came a little later. So let's get started with the Union Pacific, and what all kind of went down, how it started, and I guess in general, the origins of the Union Pacific. So was incorporated July 1st, 1862 under an act of Congress called the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. It was approved by President Lincoln and provided for the constructions of railroad from the Missouri River to the Pacific as a war measure for the preservation of the Union. It was constructed westward from Council Bluffs, Iowa, to meet the Central Pacific Railroad line. Central Pacific, all right, so not the Western Pacific. Central Pacific Railroad line, which was constructed eastward from Sacramento. The combined Union Pacific Central Pacific line became known as the first Continental or Transcontinental Railroad, and later the Overland Route. Constructed primarily of Irish labor, and who had learned their craft during the recent Civil War. And I'm using Wikipedia. I know it's not a great source, but depends on what you're looking into. But you can always find good articles from Wikipedia. So Wikipedia is not a completely trash source. But anyway, primarily of Irish labor, and under the guidance of its dominant stockholder, Dr. Thomas Clark Durant, namesake of the city Durant, Iowa. First rails were laid in Omaha. The two lines were joined at Promontory Summit, Utah, 53 miles west of Ogden, Utah, on May 10th, 1869, hence creating the first transcontinental railroad in North America. So, all that means is, well, they needed a way to get all the gold and silver from the mines in California and Nevada back to the East Coast to pay for the war against the South, and so passed through Congress, signed into law by good old Abe Lincoln, Honest Abe, never hurt a fly, and it led to, as you can imagine, a ton of corruption. So out of this led to what was known as the credit mobilier scandal. So it was, for the most part, legalized fraud, conducted from 1864 to 1867 by the Union Pacific Railroad and a company called the Credit Mobilier of America. So it was initially, what was the origins? Here we go. It was initially called, the hell was it called? Anyhow, it was like Pennsylvania something or other auction house or some weird name. But anyway, the Pacific Railway Act chartered Union Pacific, and they were able to sell stock based on provide $100 million in capital investment to create this railroad. And the federal government offered to assist the railroad with a loan of $16,000 to $48,000 per mile of track, variable according to the location, for a total of more than $60 million in all, and a land grant of 20 million acres, worth anywhere from 50 to 100 million. However, the part that they were having trouble with was coming up with investors to continue investing in this project and keep it afloat, because the investors did not see really any sort of profit coming in the near future, and just the fact I was talking before, you had to carry all your supplies to build the railway to the end of the railway so you could build some more. And I mean, it was just incredibly expensive. And there was next to nothing between California and Omaha. There was mountain men, Indians, and that's about it. Fur traders, mountain men, and Indian tribes. So without any sort of, I don't want to say promise, but any sort of projection of future revenue, you know, they're not going to have a very good way to make money. So long and short, investors like to know that they're going to make a little bit of money. So what did they do? They created this company called the Credit Mobilier of America. And I can't remember what it was first called. But essentially what it was is they authorized Congress to they got Congress to pass another bill, and it was by then, how exactly did it okay, so they basically created this company called Credit Mobilier, and they became the sole construction contractor for the Union Pacific Railroad. All materials and construction would be taken care of by the Credit Mobilier, and they would bill the Union Pacific accordingly, in which case Union Pacific Railroad would present these bills to the federal government. They would tack on a certain percentage for overhead costs and overall maintenance of the railway. And it all looked on the up and up. The problem was that the owners of the Credit Mobilier of America, which was named, like I said, I don't remember what it was. I don't know where the hell I saw that either. Son of a bitch, that's gonna bug me right now. But Pennsylvania Fiscal Agency. So they okay, here we go. They persuaded Congress to pass a second Transcontinental Railroad Act in 1864. This allowed the company to sell bonds of its own and back them with the railroad's real estate. In addition, the real estate was doubled and made to include iron and coal rights. So what they did from there is now they're able to sell off some of their stock and back it with basically mortgage it with all their property. And they changed it from the name from the Pennsylvania Fiscal Agency, which was an investment firm that the government had chartered to buy and sell railroad bonds and empowered them to borrow and loan money without limit upon the resources or without the resources of the company. And the members of the board of this company were also members of the board of Union Pacific. It was what we call a shell company, and at the time, it was not illegal. So, George Francis Train, who as he had built the Atlantic and Great Western Railroad in Ohio, and then Thomas C. Durant, who was the vice president of the Union Pacific. And he said his goal from the get-go was to grab a wad from construction fees and get out. And George Francis Train had, I guess he was a big fan of how the French did things, and there was this giant bank, kind of like a J.P. Morgan today, but in France it was called the Credit Mobilier, and it was used to finance a whole bunch of projects. I read a little bit on it. You get reading into banking very much, and it's it gets depressing real quick. Real quick. Banking is probably when I had Evan Hafer on the show, and I asked him if he dealt with any kind of criminals when they were getting their coffee from Central and South America and other places over here. And he took it to mean the farmers themselves, which I was thinking more along the lines of like customs agents and shit like that. And he made the comments kind of stuck with me. He said the real criminals that you encounter when you get into the world of finance. And well, here's a good example of that. What they were doing was so Credit Mobilier would then subcontract out all these whether it be the timber or the iron or the steel, iron, whatever. They would subcontract it out, and then they would run a very legit operation. They were cutting costs wherever they could on actually building the railroad. However, they were getting paid by the mile. Union Pacific was. So they sometimes took the scenic route, if you will, or the not so scenic route, just depending on how many miles they could squeeze out of that particular section of land, and I guess not make it look too fishy. Well, then Credit Mobilier would radically mark up the construction costs, basically double what it actually cost. Cost about, I think it said 50 some million, like 55 million, and they build Union Pacific to the tune of about 100 million. And so I think all told it was about a $44 million just swindle of taxpayer money. And at the time, there was no income tax. These were all railroad bonds, I believe, is what they issued. However, the corruption must have been pretty apparent. Or at least the shadiness of Credit Mobilier. But it just so happened to be a couple of the other people that were involved in Credit Mobilier, outside of George Francis Train and Thomas C. Grant. The other one, two brothers, Oliver and Oakes Ames. And Oakes Ames just so happened to be a Republican congressman from the state of Massachusetts. Had a lot of power within the House. One of the good old boys. And it all kind of went to shit when they started using shares of Credit Mobilier stock to entice other members of Congress to look the other way, and a lot of times push regulation that would be favorable for the Union Pacific, and keep this gravy train rolling along. If this sounds like I'm repeating myself, or if it sounds like maybe you've heard of something similar to this before, it's because you have. How the government has always operated. But it's just another case of it. Well, Civil War ends, and meanwhile, this railroad's still not built. A lot of delays, labor shortages. Well, Civil War ends, the slaves are freed, and all of a sudden you've got a flood of freedmen coming up from the South. And if nothing else, those fellas know how to work. And so you get a new, fresh batch of labor, and you get some different leadership, and they with the never-ending supply of money from Congress, they keep pushing forward. 1869, it gets built. Well, then, 1872 rolls around, and this is second term. Well, I guess it was leading up to the second term of President Ulysses S. Grant. He's running for re-election, and Union Pacific was basically bankrupt. They never did file for bankruptcy, but they had been stripped of what Congress had intended to be, what they say, a permanent endowment. And Credit Mobilier was out of business, and they had an original investment of less than $1 million, and made a profit of somewhere, depending on how you figure it, because a lot of it had to do with land grants, and so there was a lot of funny accounting to it, but somewhere between $33 and $50 million is what they made off of initially a little bit less than $1 million. And George C. Train had bragged around town that he had 3 generations of his family living off of Credit Mobilier. Well, even though there had been rumors of the scandal, nothing really came out until there was a fight amongst the Credit Mobilier goons about how they're going to divide the spoils. They're going to split up the loot. And one of these dudes finally had enough, and he leaked some letters to the New York Sun that were very, very incriminating, smoking gun, if you will, to Mr. Oakes Ames, sitting member of Congress. And it later on there was a list of people that I guess under oath at a hearing, Oakes Ames read a list of men that he had either sold or given stocks of Credit Mobilier to, and they weren't just like low-level members of Congress. There was the Speaker of the House, James G. Blaine, the Vice President, Schuyler Colfax, and a future President of the United States, James Garfield. And this led to a full congressional investigation, and turned up a whole bunch of corruption, but in typical government fashion, not much happened. Oakes Ames and another person, another member of Congress, a Democrat, got censured, and everyone else pretty well got away scot-free. But in the meantime, it led to a huge drop in Union Pacific stock, and led to, well, I won't say it. It played a big part in the lead up to the Panic of 1873, in which a number of railroads went bankrupt, and that's kind of where the next person comes in, and that's Mr. James J. Hill. So, Let's see. Here's a picture of him here. And he, this article says James J. Hill was a different breed from others who built transcontinental railroads across the U.S. First of all, he was from Canada, born in Ontario, and lost his father at an early age. Supported his mother as soon as he could work. Worked in a grocery during his early youth. At 17, left Canada for St. Paul, Minnesota, where he found work as a clerk in the transportation company. As he matured and accumulated savings, he invested in shipping, then steamships, and finally railroad. There was a bankrupt railroad in the area right after the 1873 panic, St. Paul and Pacific Railroad. Hill and other Canadians, so there was like a fur trader, president of the Hudson Bay Company, and then a banker of some sort, I believe, purchased the bankrupt railroad from its bondholders with intentions of completing its track. There was only 10 miles of track, not all connected, when Hill and his associates purchased it. The railroad had received subsidies, but those were not sufficient to overcome the railroad's mismanagement, or perhaps it was mismanaged because of the availability of the subsidy. Hill and his group completed the St. Paul and Pacific line, which only extended into Minnesota, and they ran it profitably. Hill then decided to extend the railroad into North Dakota. He built carefully and promoted agricultural development of the area his railroad served. So, eventually, and it took him quite a little bit longer, he ended up connecting Minneapolis with Seattle. But the way he went about it was just completely different. So, I read a lot of different articles, but there's a piece from Foundation for Economic Education, fee.org, and it goes pretty in depth on this. But it, like I said, it was a lot of people say it was and like I said, I don't know if it was if Ayn Rand ever said this is who the inspiration was, or if it's just speculated or what. But anyway, I guess full transparency, I have never finished Atlas Shrugged. I've tried to get through it several different times, and it's some pretty intense reading at times. Not like the subject matter is intense. It's just she's a good writer, but it's a little tough to get through at times, and I've just never finished it. But I've got a pretty good overall guess as to the entire story of it. But James Jerome Hill, he was the only railroad entrepreneur of the 19th century who received no federal subsidies to build his railroads, and he was a wealthy man. Estimated $63 million. I'm not sure how much that would be today, but it's a lot. He strange. I haven't been able to find a whole lot on this little incident, but he so his father died when he was young. So he had to temporarily forgo formal education to help with family finances. Showing academic ability. However, he received free tuition at Rockwood Academy. Hill later lost an eye to an accidental arrow shot, preventing him from pursuing the career in medicine that his parents had hoped for. That's all I've been able to find on that particular note is accidental arrow shot. I don't know if it was like a bunch of kids jackassing around, or he was out in the middle of the woods on during deer season. I'm not for sure. Turned out to be pretty lucky for him because he he was not able to fight in the Civil War because of that. He only had one eye. But he also he was a guy that wasn't going to sit out, so he organized the first Minnesota Volunteers, and he worked there as a warehouseman, and basically his whole time there, he learned the ins and outs of just logistics and shipping. He was pressing and selling hay for the troops' horses, and by doing that, he learned how to buy and sell goods at a profit and find the fastest, cheapest, most efficient way to ship the goods. And then he went to work for the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad. And at the time, they were using wood to fuel their locomotives. And James J. Hill, he believed that coal was going to be cheaper, so he made a contract with some company to supply it for him. And then he also teamed up with a guy from Connecticut named Chauncey Griggs, who had a wholesale grocery business, and they created Hill, Griggs and Company, where they dealt with fuel and shipping, merchandising, and warehousing. And then he later became interested in the Red River of the North that flows up to Lake Winnipeg. And at the time, Winnipeg was known as Fort Garry, and it was an important trading post for the Hudson's Bay Company. And he started moving his personal belongings up there, and then a fellow named Norman Ketson left Hudson Bay Company to team up with John J. Hill, and they formed the Red River Transportation Company. And along the way, he traveled up and down the Red River, and he took notice of the region, saw that it had really good rich soil, and he at the same time, the company that he was working for, St. Paul and Pacific, or that he used to work for, was going under, and then the panic happens. So he takes his money, and he's able to convince a bunch of people to join him. And at the time, they bought the St. Paul and Pacific for $280,000. And this article was wrote in 2001. So $2001, it was $3.9 million, which John Hill estimated to be about 20% of what it was actually worth. And from the get-go, this guy did it a little bit different. So although he never took any subsidies, the company that he bought, the St. Paul and Pacific, had a whole bunch of land grants throughout the Midwest. So I guess you could say he was kind of subsidized to a certain extent. But from then on out, he ran a completely different way. There was no government funding, and therefore there was no just hurry to get across to the Pacific. You had to make it profitable. And he did that in a number of different ways, but start off with, his track cost a little bit more to build because he imported the steel from England, because at the time the U.S. steel industry was not as advanced and up to snuff as the Brits were. So he imported all of his steel rail in from England, and even though it cost more, his train or his tracks lasted longer, and it was pretty much from day one, it was more efficiently ran because him and his investors were the ones who were gonna lose anything if there was money to be lost, and there was a lot of money to be lost back in the, especially on where they're trying to go. So initially, after buying it, he starts expanding. He connects the initial 10 miles of track or whatever, and then he starts building north up to Winnipeg, Fort Garry. And from there, they connected to Canadian railway, and and since the Canadian Pacifics, they hadn't made their way all the way across Canada, Transcontinental. All of Canadian railway traffic had to go through Fort Garry, Winnipeg, and they had to use John J. Hill's line there. So from there, like I said, he had to get creative to make it profitable, and to do that, he made deals with farmers, and they actually set up basically recruiting offices over in like Scotland and England and Sweden and Norway, a lot of the Scandinavian countries. And he was a very, very insightful man, very forward thinking. So he took note of the land, soil, and I would say probably most importantly the weather, and thought, hey, who would want to come over here and farm in this cold, miserable cocksucker? I bet a bunch of Swedes and Norwegians would. And so that's where he went. And to entice them over, he offered fare on his train from the Midwest, so Minneapolis or wherever. I think he had some lines that went down into Chicago as well. But you could get your railway fare from there to either like North Dakota, Minnesota, North Dakota, or even into Montana as they went for $10 at the time. So hell of a good deal. And also, he sold you land, which he owned, or the railroad owned through these land grants. They would sell them to these new immigrant farmers at a lower than market rate, with the stipulations that they had to use these farming practices that he had helped develop. Not him so much, but he hired some good researchers, agronomists, soil scientists to develop what they thought would be the best way to farm in the northern plains, and it worked. So they got these immigrant farmers to buy the land and farm it in these particular ways. Next thing you know, they had kind of just a huge bumper crop compared to the rest of the Midwest, and that meant more freight for the Great Northern Railway. So he just started developing a customer base and laying track as he went. But he also had his hand in the Canadian Pacific Railway, and so he would scout them out and find the best ways for him to go. And one of the once he ended up buying the St. Paul and Pacific, he cut ties with the Canada Pacific and started charting their own path. And because they were trying to be profitable the whole time, they picked out the most efficient way to get across, and they ended up finding the lowest pass in the Rockies at the time. I think it was like Marias Pass is, and there was also the only transcontinental railroad that didn't have to build a tunnel. And it was just pretty incredible. Some of the things, like they had their own designed the own some different rail cars, passenger cars, just for immigrant farmers, so they'd have a place to stay on the train, but also, like, they had separate cars for all their equipment and whatnot. They also included incentives such as free seed and feed for their cattle, sometimes free livestock. But he knew that if he could just get them out there and producing, they would come to him to use his railway to move their product. And by doing this, he was eventually able to acquire the Northern Pacific Railway in 1893, and there was another, I guess, 1896. So 1893 is I think that's when so 1893, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba, what it was called, reached the Puget Sound at Everett, Washington. But same year, a panic put the Northern Pacific as well as Santa Fe and Union Pacific into receivership, meaning they went bankrupt. And John J. Hill strikes up a deal, and they buy the Northern Pacific. And however, this got him into some legal troubles that would violate Minnesota law. I'm not sure exactly what it was. That I'm not sure how exactly it would violate Minnesota law, but he got around it by not buying it as the railroad, but got a bunch of his buddies and board members of the Great Northern they bought the Northern Pacific stock. shady financing going on all over the place, but eventually, like, he was working on building up trade with Japan as well. Found a market for American cotton. The textile mills in Japan were using Indian cotton, and so John J. Hill ships a bunch of Southern cotton up to Seattle and ships it over to Japan and sells it to these Japanese textile mills at a way under market price, way under. And just to get the Japanese to using the cotton and try to make the case that it's a better quality cotton than they were making in India at the time. I don't know if that's the case or not, but America, fuck yeah. So, and that is kind of what got him into trouble. Somehow he ended up with J.P. Morgan, and they teamed up to buy. Oh, let's see here. It was Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. So Hill realized that the only eastbound traffic the first few years would be lumber, and this would make the line less profitable than it might be. Wishing to acquire a line in Chicago and St. Louis where he could deliver the lumber, Hill researched Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Rocky Mountains. This acquisition would also give him a line that could haul cotton to St. Louis and Kansas City and connect the smelters of Denver's and the Black Hills. The trains would be kept full at all times. Working with J.P. Morgan, Hill succeeded in purchasing the Chicago, Burlington, Quincy. Hill now began to expand his shipping empire internationally via Seattle. He supplied Japan with cotton from the south and shipped New England cotton goods to China. He also shipped northern goods such as Minnesota flour and Colorado metals to Asia. He continued to expand his railroads in the early 20th century. He was just he was a shipping fool. But he was also big into conservation, and he says, unlike most environmentalists today, he'll believe that natural resources should be privately owned and locally controlled. So in some cases, he believed in state-level ownership was justifiable. He considered the federal government too distant to completely manage resources. Indeed, he once criticized the U.S. Forest Service, saying the worst scandals of state land misappropriation are insignificant when compared to its record. His interest in conservation stemmed both from his concern for the nation's food supply and from business concerns. Since his railroads largely transported agricultural products, Hill paid close attention to fluctuations in the grain markets. Falling grain yields in the Great Plains would mean fewer goods to transport. He believed that better farming methods would increase yields and conserve soil quality. So that's, as we talked about earlier. And he used his own resources for agricultural research and the dissemination of its findings to farmers. So, like I said, he hired really good soil scientists and agronomy people, and it made sense. And not only did it help these farmers, because they said they were yielding 60 to 90% more than the conventional acreage at the time. Not only were they making more money because they were growing better crops, but he made more money because he got to transport it all. In a speech, Hill once said, "Out of the conservation movement and its practical application to our common life may come wealth greater than could be won by the overthrow of kingdoms and the annexation of provinces, national prestige and individual well-being. The gift of broader mental horizons, and best, most necessary of all, the quality of a national citizenship which has learned to rule its own spirit and to rise by the control of its own desire." Just pretty incredible. He eventually got caught up in an antitrust lawsuit, but they're still around today. They're known as the Burlington, Northern, and Santa Fe. And he was, I don't know, I think it's just one of those, I don't know if, like I said, back to the Ayn Rand deal. I don't, it's pretty obvious that like he played a big impact on the writing of Atlas Shrugged. But it's just a pretty neat in the just example throughout history of how the private sector does stuff so much better than when the government gets involved. Here you have a guy who was pinching pennies, and then also I read somewhere during that 1893 panic when so many of these railroads went bankrupt. Actually, they all went bankrupt except for the one run by James J. Hill. And to avoid that, he cut costs wherever he could, and that included with the employees. And they went on strike, and so the labor movement was kind of in its infant stages at the time, and it was not I guess I don't know if it was an official union that went on strike, but however, they went to arbitration, and he ended up conceding almost every single point that the employees that were on strike, that all the concessions that they wanted made, he conceded to almost all of them, just in order to get back to work. And pretty insane that out of all the other railroads, he was the only one that never declared bankruptcy. But he, it's funny that he gave a speech at the National Conservation Congress in 1910, and it's funny how much it kind of translates to today. But here's a little quote from it. It says, "Shall we abandon everything to centralized authority, going the way of every lost and ruined government of the world, or meet our personal duty by personal labor through the organs of local self-government, not yet wholly atrophied by disuse? Shall we permit the continued increase of public expenditure and public debt till capital and credit have suffered in the same conflict that overthrew prosperous and happy nations in the past, or insist upon a return to honest and practical economy?" So 1910's kind of the height of the progressive movement, and there's a huge push towards centralization of power and bigger government. And here we are 110 years later, and I guess the same shit, different day, basically. Anyhow, he turned over the reins of the Great Northern Railroad to his son in 1907, and died in 1916 at the age of 77. But it's fascinating how one guy, I mean, granted, and he had partners and everything, but he was the guy at the head of it. Just clawed and scratched and made that thing profitable, and was directly related to the settling of the Northern Plains. And I guess to wrap it up, or bring it full circle, you heard at the beginning of the show, brought to you by Stetson Ranches out of Fromberg, Montana. And it's funny, the Northern Pacific Railroad came to Fromberg because of a fella who happens to coincide with my lead sponsor for quite a while now, Stetson Ranches. The barn at Stetson Ranch was made by a fellow, or was built. He didn't make it. He didn't do any of the building, but financed it all. Built by a fellow named Samuel Debo. He was a French businessman, and had started the mine, the Debo mine, there just outside of Fromberg. And unlike the government subsidized railroads, if there was money to be made by going up to Fromberg, a guy like James J. Hill, if he thought he could make some money out of it, keep those trains running, he was going to do it. And because of that entrepreneurial spirit between Samuel Debo and John J. Hill, that led to the Central Pacific, or the Northern Pacific Railroad, coming to Fromberg. And it's pretty incredible that how different those paths were. And even though it took about 20 years longer to reach Seattle than it did for the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific to meet in Utah, it was done without taxpayer money. It was done with, well, I won't say it was done without corruption. I'm sure there's always corruption when you're dealing with that type of business, but far less corruption, and far less scandal, and just a lot more hard work. And I don't know. And then it's just funny. One of the big questions thrown at libertarians is who's going to build the roads? Well, James J. Hill built a railroad, and he did it the right way. There's always the question of ownership when it comes to the railroads, but outside of the land grants that he acquired with the initial railroad, he bought the land from the federal government, bought it fair and square, and because of that, he was able to build the most efficient routes and the quickest routes, and he was able to plot his routes according to how he was able to make money. And if there wasn't a way to make money, he attracted people that would bring him money in the future. He went out and got people from Norway and Sweden and Scotland and Ireland and England and brought them out, said, hey, farm here, raise cattle here, and we'll help you get started, because once you have a product, you're going to need a way to get it to market. And, well, you already know the way. You know the trains already. So it was just, I don't know, it's just, it's funny how so much has changed, but how politics hasn't. And anytime you get a merger of politicians and corporations, it doesn't ever lead anywhere good. But I don't know. You can always find little bright spots throughout history that makes you think, well, we could do something like that today. I don't, railroad being a completely different thing, but I've often wondered, and I'm starting to see the beef market change, and where more and more ranchers are, I guess, taking their product in their own hand and trying to make a go out of it that way, instead of pinning on the big boys to play fair with them. And I don't know, it just that entrepreneurial spirit. There's something about the people of America that they've always, I won't say always, and it's kind of lacking here lately, but there's always that spirit of, like, how can we do it better? Want something more, want something better. And I think that was the case with not that it wasn't the case with the Union Pacific, and there were people trying to make a buck, and they were skirting around the law. They were, outside of trading it, bribing congressmen, nothing they did was illegal. But when you bring the government involved, and it leads to a shitty system, and it led to a bankrupt railroad, and one that got bailed out I don't know how many times, but it's versus one where they start slow and make sure they can be sustainable, and they ran it like a business, because there was no government support to clean up the mess if they ran it the wrong way. So it's just a pretty clear, obvious example of the free market doing it better than the government. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. Hope it made some sort of sense. But thanks for tuning in. I sure appreciate you guys. And hey, have a good week, and move your ass. We're burning daylight.
Your eyes up in the morning, beneath the stars so bright. Pull your hat down, make sure your cinch is tight. Horses kinda snuffy, cold chill up your spine. We'll get your ass moving, son, we're burning daylight. Burning daylight. Burning daylight. In the saddle till the job's done right. Just together, and you won't catch 'em all. But when you ride through the gate, make sure you sit up tall. I can see the horizon, it's looking pretty bright. Well, get your ass moving, son, we're burning daylight. Burning daylight. Burning daylight. In the done right.